She said, "You can't handle money, Mom. You'll just waste it." She said it while wearing my pearls, the ones my husband gave me on our 40th anniversary. And she said it with that tone that's halfway between pity and finality, as if the verdict had already been signed and I was merely waiting to be dismissed. I remember the air that morning, still heavy with funeral lilies, the scent so thick it clung to the curtains. My husband had been gone only 2 days, and I was still folding his sweaters, still listening for his cough in the hallway. And there she was, my only daughter, sitting across from me with a folder in her lap and the kind of focus she usually reserved for her clients. She had driven down from the city the night before, full of efficiency, her phone pinging every few minutes with messages from her firm. She told me she had taken time off to help me get my affairs in order. I thought she meant funeral bills, paperwork, the small, unbearable tasks of ending a life. I didn't realize she meant my life. Clara has always had that way of making generosity sound like strategy. When she was little, she used to organize her birthday presents by size, not by sentiment. I should have known. I should have seen the warning in that. She looked at me across the dining table, where the china was still laid out from the condolence lunch. "Mom," she said, "you shouldn't have to worry about accounts and taxes and maintenance. The house is too big for you. I'll take care of it all. We'll transfer things to my name for simplicity, for protection." She even smiled, that calm professional smile that makes you feel silly for resisting. I remember nodding because I was tired, because the house felt enormous and empty, because grief makes you stupidly trusting. The pen she handed me was heavy, gold-tipped, and the papers smooth under my fingers. I didn't read them carefully. I just signed where she pointed, like a woman signing a delivery receipt for her own disappearance. The house by the lake had been our pride. My husband and I bought it in the 70s, when the roof still leaked, and the dock was just a crooked plank. We built everything ourselves. He hammered, I painted. We argued over curtain colors and laughed about whose turn it was to sweep the pine needles off the porch. It wasn't just property. It was time made solid. Every beam held a memory. I thought Clara understood that, but to her it was an asset, not a home. She had grown up in those rooms, but she saw only square footage and market value. After the papers were signed, she hugged me quickly, said I was doing the smart thing, and promised to handle the sale. "You'll have less to worry about," she said. I didn't realize that meant she'd arranged for me to have almost nothing at all. 2 weeks later, movers came. Not my movers, hers. They packed the furniture with the precision of strangers touching artifacts. She told me she had found a lovely little apartment for me in a new complex downtown near medical facilities with on-site wellness programs. I heard the subtext, near supervision. When I asked what would happen to the house, she avoided my eyes. "We'll put it on the market," she said, as if the decision had been mutual, as if she and I had sat together and agreed. I still had the smell of varnish from the last summer we'd refinished the floors. I still knew where every creak in the stairs lived. The thought of strangers walking through it, commenting on potential, made my throat close, but I didn't argue. I let her drive me to the new apartment. I smiled at the building manager, signed the lease Clara had already negotiated, and watched her set up the security system like she was installing invisible walls around me. That first night there, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, a sound that had no history with me. I looked around at the white walls, at the furniture she had chosen, gray, efficient, impersonal, and I felt like a guest in some waiting room for the unwanted. My old house had smelled of wood and lemon polish. This place smelled of disinfectant and new paint. Clara called at 9 to remind me to take my medication, though I had been the one who organized her vitamins when she was a child. Try to rest, she said. It's all handled now. She didn't say by whom. The next morning, she sent a text. I'm setting up auto-pay for your expenses. Please don't worry about your bank account anymore. I'll manage it from my end. The phrase, from my end, settled over me like frost. Days passed in a blur of adjustment. I tried to decorate, a photo of my husband on the shelf, a quilt over the sofa, but it all looked misplaced, like nostalgia smuggled into a sterile space. Neighbors nodded politely in the hallway, people who didn't know I had once owned a whole lakefront inn, who saw me only as another elderly tenant with careful steps and predictable groceries. When I mentioned to Clara that I might join a local bridge club, she sighed audibly. Mom, those groups can be confusing. I don't want you overexerting yourself. Why don't you just rest and read? Rest, again, that word. It sounded less like care and more like sedation. Sometimes she would visit on weekends, all heels and perfume and controlled impatience, inspecting the place like a property manager. She'd open the fridge, frown at my groceries, replace my sugar with stevia. You have to take better care of yourself, she'd say, rearranging my life into her idea of order. She never stayed long. There was always a call waiting, a client, a dinner. When she left, she'd pat my shoulder the way you pat a child's head. Once, she slipped $100 bill into my hand and said, for little extras, just don't spend it on junk. I wanted to tell her that I had managed family budgets through recessions, that I had paid for her college tuition with double shifts, that the house she sold was built from every unpaid weekend of my youth. But she looked at me with that mixture of efficiency and exasperation that makes words useless. I began walking by the lake in the mornings, even though it was a bus ride away. I'd sit on a bench near where our dock used to be, though I couldn't see the house from there. It was hidden behind hedges and someone else's patio furniture now. Sometimes I saw new curtains in the windows, and I imagined them laughing, hosting parties, never knowing the woman who once sanded those floors until her fingers bled. I told myself not to care, but care has its own gravity. It pulls at you even when you pretend to have let go. The world around me shrank to practicalities, pills, doctor appointments, polite smiles from nurses who called me by my first name as if intimacy could replace respect. My daughter's control extended into every corner. She switched my phone plan, canceled my old credit card, told me she'd handled donations to the charities I used to support. One evening, she arrived unannounced with a new tablet. You'll find this easier, she said, setting it up with all my accounts already synced. I asked for the passwords, and she smiled. You don't need them, Mom. You'll just get confused. Then she laughed lightly, as if that made it tender instead of terrifying. I started keeping small coins in a teapot by the stove. It began as a joke, a kind of secret savings, like a child hoarding treasures. But over time it became something else, a quiet symbol that not everything I had was under her control. I dropped change there from grocery trips, from a neighbor who insisted on paying me for mending her scarf, from a stray dollar I found in an old coat pocket. It wasn't about the money. It was about remembering that I could still own something, however small, that didn't require permission. At night, I would sit by the window, watching the lights of the city blink like indifferent stars. I thought about the years I spent building a life that could stand on its own, only to see it neatly folded into someone else's portfolio. There's a particular cruelty in being erased politely. No shouting, no overt betrayal, just a sequence of helpful gestures that leave you weightless. I would sometimes rehearse what I'd say if she ever truly asked how I was. I'd tell her that being managed isn't the same as being loved, that dependence can be a kind of quiet death. but she never asked, not really. She only wanted confirmation that everything was under control. Grief turned into something sharper, not for my husband, but for myself. I missed the version of me that used to fix broken light fixtures and negotiate with plumbers, the woman who once ran an inn full of laughter and noise, who decided things. I missed being necessary. My daughter's world had no room for necessity. It had systems, plans, investments. I was an emotional liability, tidy but inconvenient. I remember one Sunday when she took me out for brunch. The waiter asked if we were celebrating something, and Clara smiled. "Just keeping Mom entertained," she said. Entertained. I almost laughed. I was the entertainment, the relic she could point to, proof of her dutiful goodness. That afternoon, as she drove me back to the apartment, she said she'd been thinking of transferring my medical proxy to her attorney for efficiency. I asked quietly, "Do you think I can't make decisions for myself?" She kept her eyes on the road and said, "Mom, it's not about that. It's just, things are complicated at your age, my age." The phrase carried the finality of a locked door. When she dropped me off, she leaned across the console, kissed my cheek, and said, "Try not to worry. You're safe now." Safe, as if freedom were a danger, as if safety meant surrender. I walked up to the apartment slowly, each step echoing with the sound of my own permission slipping away. I didn't know it then, but that moment, the quiet click of the door behind me, the sterile air of that place, was the beginning of something else. Because safety, I would learn, is not what you're given. It's what you take back. It began quietly, like all the worst betrayals do, with polite paperwork and the illusion of cooperation. A month after I'd moved into the apartment, Clara came by with a banker in a gray suit who introduced himself as Mr. Donnelly, her financial advisor. He spoke in that tone reserved for the elderly and the unprofitable, gentle, deliberate, and faintly patronizing. He said he wanted to make sure my assets were aligned for long-term security. I remember the phrase because it sounded like something mechanical, as if my life could be tightened with a wrench. He spread out documents across my coffee table, the surface still cluttered with my teacup, and the small vase of daisies I kept to make the place less sterile. I tried to follow the lines of print, the percentages, the polite legalese, but grief had slowed my eyes and my patience. Clara sat beside me, touching my arm, murmuring reassurances. "It's just a reallocation, Mom. We're consolidating everything so you won't have to juggle multiple accounts. You'll have one simple monthly deposit for your living expenses. Think of it as streamlining." The word streamlining sounded efficient, modern, and cruel. When I asked what would happen to the rest of the money, she smiled, the way she used to when I questioned her teenage explanations for missing curfew. "I'm investing it, Mom. That's what I do. You'll thank me when you see how much it grows." The banker nodded as though she'd just presented a quarterly report. He pointed to the lines where I needed to sign. I hesitated, my pen hovering over the page. "Do I still have access to the accounts?" I asked. Clara laughed softly, the way people laugh when you ask if the earth is flat. "Of course, Mom, but it'll all be under my management. It's safer that way. Fewer mistakes." There it was again, that quiet implication that age had eroded not just my body, but my competence. I signed because she was my daughter, because the man in the suit looked official, because grief fogs the mind like smoke. When they left, the apartment felt smaller. The banker shook my hand with the faintest condescension and said, "You're in excellent hands." He didn't specify whose. Weeks later, I discovered what I had done. My monthly deposit arrived on time, Precisely the amount Clara had mentioned, enough to cover rent and modest groceries, but none of the freedom I had once known. When I called the bank to check my balance, the woman on the line said politely, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, but this account is jointly managed. Any changes require your co-signer's approval." Co-signer. The word hit like a bruise. My daughter had made herself my gatekeeper. I hung up slowly, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the teapot of coins as if it were my only currency in the world. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that she meant well, that she was only protecting me from bureaucratic confusion. But small signs began to gather, like dust in corners. My mail started arriving opened, envelopes slit neatly at the top. When I asked about it, Clara said she'd had the post office forward important documents to her address for safekeeping. When I received a call from the property manager about the final sale of the lake house, Clara intercepted, insisting she'd handle the closing. "It's too much stress for you," she said, her tone honeyed and final. That night, I called the property office myself, using the number I had written down years ago in an old address book. The woman on the line sounded surprised to hear from me. "Mrs. Hayes, the sale already went through," she said. "Your daughter signed as power of attorney." I told her that couldn't be possible, that I had never signed such a document. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that tastes like disbelief. "Well, I'm not sure how it was arranged, but the paperwork is complete." I thanked her mechanically and hung up. The phone felt heavy in my hand, as if it carried the weight of something irreversible. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. Same face, same gray hair, pinned neatly back, but I felt suddenly transparent, like the outline of a person fading from her own story. When Clara came by that weekend, I confronted her, gently at first. "You sold the house without telling me." She poured herself a glass of mineral water and didn't meet my eyes. "I told you, Mom. You agreed to the transfer. It was all above board." "Above board," I repeated. "You forged my consent." She set the glass down, sighed dramatically. "Oh, please, don't be melodramatic. It's done. The house was too much. You couldn't have kept up the taxes or maintenance. You'd have ended up selling it anyway, probably for less. This way, it's handled." That word again. Handled. As if I were a logistical issue, not a person. I wanted to slap the calm out of her face, but instead I asked where the money had gone. "Investments," she said, already reaching for her phone. And yet, even as anger surged, part of me crumbled with shame. Because she was my daughter, because I had raised her to be strong, to never depend on anyone. I had taught her independence, and she had used it to chain me. The next morning, she sent an email with a spreadsheet attached, color-coded, professional, heartless. It outlined my monthly allowance, projected through the year. At the bottom, she wrote, "This should cover all your needs comfortably. Please don't make large purchases without consulting me first. Love, Clara." That last word, tacked on like a disclaimer, nearly broke me. I spent the rest of the day staring out the window, watching people walk their dogs, wondering if anyone else had ever been raised so quietly. One afternoon, when I went to buy a small gift for my neighbor's grandson, my card was declined. The cashier smiled apologetically. I called the bank as soon as I got home, and they told me the limit had been lowered. "For fraud protection," they explained. I didn't need to ask who had made the request. Clara confirmed it later in her matter-of-fact tone. "You're on a fixed income now, Mom. I don't want you to overspend." Overspend? On what? A pair of socks and a book for a child? The indignity burned deeper than any insult. After that, something in me began to retreat. I stopped telling her about my plans. I stopped mentioning the things I missed. She had a way of turning every longing into an accusation of weakness. When I said I missed driving, she said, "The traffic's dangerous at your age." When I said I missed the lake, she said, "It's full of mold and mosquitoes." When I said I miss my husband, she said, "You need to live in the present." Her present was a sterile apartment with remote monitoring, a curated life stripped of risk and, therefore, meaning. But betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It seeps until it becomes the air you breathe. One evening, as I was preparing tea, I found an envelope wedged behind the stack of bills Clara had brought me to review. It was from the escrow office, addressed to me, not her. I opened it and found a single sheet summarizing the sale. Final payment withheld pending signature of remaining title holder. My hands trembled. The remaining title holder was me. Somehow, in all her precision, she had overlooked one small detail. The sale wasn't entirely complete. That meant a portion of the money still legally belonged to me, locked but reachable. It was like finding a pulse in a body you thought had gone cold. I slipped the letter into my purse, heart thudding, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce clarity. The next morning, I called the lawyer listed on the document. His secretary told me he could see me that afternoon. I didn't tell Clara. I put on my best coat, the navy one my husband used to say made me look formidable, and I took the bus downtown. The city felt different that day, less like a maze, more like a map I could still read. In the lawyer's office, everything smelled of paper and coffee. He was a young man, brisk but not unkind. I handed him the letter, and he examined it carefully. "You're still on the title," he said. "Your daughter can't finalize the transfer without your signature. The remaining funds are being held until that's resolved." He looked up, curious. "Did you intend to sell?" "No," I said. "I intended to trust my daughter." His expression softened. "Then I suggest you don't sign anything else without independent counsel." I left his office with a copy of the document and a small, exquisite sensation in my chest, a flicker of control, fragile but alive. I walked 3 blocks before realizing my hands were shaking, not from age, but from the adrenaline of self-reclamation. The bus ride home felt like a journey back into my own name. When I arrived, I placed the document in the teapot beneath the coins. It was the safest place I could think of. That night, Clara called. Her voice was bright, performative. "Just checking in. How are you feeling?" I almost told her. I almost let the truth spill out. The meeting, the lawyer, the remaining funds. But something stopped me. Maybe instinct, maybe wisdom. Instead, I said, "Fine, darling, just fine." When I hung up, I laughed quietly, a sound rusty from disuse. For the first time since my husband's funeral, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. And that, I realized, was the true beginning of everything that would come next. The following morning felt different, though nothing in the world had visibly changed. The same faint hum of the refrigerator, the same streaks of early sunlight cutting across the blinds, the same polite silence of my apartment where no one ever truly visited. But underneath it all, there was a subtle vibration, the quiet electricity of awareness. It is a strange thing, realizing that your helplessness has been a performance someone wrote for you. Once you recognize the script, every line begins to sound false. I poured my tea slowly, watching the steam rise, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid of what might happen if I disobeyed. The teapot was no longer just a hiding place for coins and secrets. It had become a small monument to resistance. I told myself that I would wait, that I wouldn't act rashly. but the knowledge of that untouched portion of the sale, money that was still legally mine, glowed at the back of my mind like a live ember. Clara called around noon, her voice brisk and full of concern that didn't belong to her. She asked about my medications, my diet, my sleep schedule, all the things you ask someone you believe can't manage on their own. I gave her vague answers and listened to her talk about her new project, a financial portfolio for a chain of wellness centers. It's all about longevity, she said, laughing lightly. Keeping people alive and stable as long as possible. I thought of myself then, filed somewhere in her mind, between accounts receivable and recurring expenses. When she finally hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet, letting the truth of her voice settle. She didn't even sound cruel anymore, just efficient, as if affection had been replaced by productivity. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk, the kind of simple, aimless walk I used to take with my husband after dinner when the world felt breathable. I put on my navy coat and stepped outside into the weak winter sun. The air was cold enough to bite, but kind enough to wake me. The city had a rhythm I had forgotten, people rushing with purpose, the smell of coffee spilling from doorways, a dog barking with the pure conviction of being alive. For months I had moved through everything as a ghost, but now I felt the faint pulse of being visible again. I walked to the bus stop, not sure where I meant to go, only knowing that I needed distance. When I sat down on the plastic seat, an older woman beside me smiled faintly. She wore a scarf the color of mustard and smelled faintly of cinnamon. "You headed somewhere nice?" she asked. "Just out," I said. "Anywhere away from four walls." She nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned that escape doesn't always require a destination. We rode together for a few stops before she got off, leaving behind a trace of perfume that reminded me of my mother. I stayed on the bus until the route turned toward the lake, drawn there by a mixture of nostalgia and defiance. I hadn't seen it since the sale, since that afternoon when I realized the home I built had become a line item on someone else's spreadsheet. When the bus stopped near the waterfront, I hesitated before stepping off. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, familiar and cruel. The lake shimmered under a pale sun, and for a moment I could almost hear the creak of the old dock, the clink of my husband's tools, the laughter of Clara when she was still small enough to run barefoot through the grass. But the house, my house, was gone behind a new iron gate. Through the slats I could see glimpses of a freshly painted deck, a modern patio, and a row of impersonal white chairs lined up like soldiers facing the water. The wind was colder there, sharper, and I realized I was standing outside my own history like an uninvited guest. A man in a maintenance uniform approached, asking politely if I needed help. I shook my head and said I was just passing through. "Beautiful property," he said, looking toward the house. "New owners really fixed it up. Bought it from a family last year, I think. They said the old lady who lived here moved to the city." I smiled faintly. "Did they?" I asked. He nodded, oblivious. "They're from California. Don't like winter much, but they love the view." I thanked him, though I could barely feel my lips. As I walked away, the ache in my chest deepened. It wasn't just loss. It was replacement. The world had filled the space where I once existed and didn't even notice the exchange. I wandered through the nearby park, trying to steady myself. On a bench near the pond, a pair of teenagers were taking photos, laughing into their phones. One of them dropped her scarf, and without thinking, I bent to pick it up and handed it to her. She smiled distractedly, said thanks, and ran off, already absorbed in her screen. That small act of invisibility struck harder than I expected. To her, I was background, a harmless, forgettable shape. It occurred to me then how perfectly I had been erased. Not by malice, but by omission, by the gradual fading of relevance. I sat for a while, feeling the cold seep through the fabric of my coat, and decided that if I didn't move soon, I might turn into stone. I returned home by dusk. The apartment was dark, as if it had been waiting in judgment. On the counter was a note from Clara. She must have stopped by while I was gone. Her handwriting was neat, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. Mom, please remember to stay in. The neighborhood isn't safe for wandering. Call me before you go out next time. Also, I've changed your medication schedule. Take the blue pills in the morning now. Love, C. The signature felt like a stamp on a report, not affection. I folded the note neatly, then tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about defying her instructions. Over the next few days, her control tightened in subtler ways. She called the building manager to authorize a home health check, which meant a young nurse arrived unannounced once a week to take my blood pressure and ask if I'd fallen recently. She adjusted the thermostat remotely, claiming it was for efficiency. She began filtering my emails, forwarding only the ones she deemed important. My life had become a curated exhibit, pleasant to look at but sealed behind glass, and yet beneath that glass, something was moving, gathering force. The more she tried to manage me, the more I began to notice the cracks in her perfection. It was small things at first. She forgot to pay my electric bill 1 month, and when I mentioned it, she brushed it off, blaming the company. She scheduled a doctor's appointment for me but mixed up the dates, insisting later that I must have written it down wrong. Her voice, once so unshakably certain, carried a faint edge of fatigue. I began to see her not as omnipotent but as frantic, a woman so terrified of losing control that she'd rather destroy the object of her care than let it live freely. It was an uncomfortable realization, but it brought me an odd comfort. Monsters are less frightening when you recognize their fear. One evening, I decided to visit the small cafe on the corner, a modest place with wooden tables and the smell of burnt toast. It was the first time in months I had gone out without Clara's approval. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and chipped nail polish, smiled when I ordered tea and apple pie. "You remind me of my grandma," she said absent-mindedly, wiping the counter. "She used to come here every Thursday." I asked where her grandmother lived, and she said, "Oh, she passed last year. Still feels like she's around, though." We talked for a while, two strangers bridging generations. When I paid the bill, she said, "You should come back, okay? We don't get many people who actually talk anymore." It was such a small sentence, but it landed with unexpected weight. Someone wanted me to come back. When I returned home that night, the apartment felt slightly less hostile. I brewed another pot of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. I thought about that young waitress, about the man at the lake, about the cinnamon-scented woman on the bus. None of them knew me, yet each had offered me something that Clara never did: the acknowledgement of presence. I realized then that I didn't need my daughter's permission to exist meaningfully. I only needed to keep moving, to expand the small radius she had drawn around me. A week later, I withdrew a portion of cash from the joint account. Nothing significant, just enough to feel the weight of paper between my fingers. I told myself it was for emergencies, but the truth was simpler. I needed to prove to myself that I still could. I placed it carefully inside an old envelope and hid it beneath the liner of my dresser drawer. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. It wasn't rest born of peace, but of possibility. Clara noticed the change in me almost immediately. During her next visit, she scanned the apartment with a subtle suspicion, asking too many questions, her tone a little too bright. "You've been going out more," she said. "I can tell. You look flushed." I smiled politely and said nothing. She frowned, sensing defiance but unable to name it. When she left, she lingered at the door longer than usual, as if debating whether to lock it from the outside. The quiet worsening of our relationship didn't happen in arguments, but in absences. I began calling less, and she began arriving unannounced. I stopped explaining myself, and she started leaving notes instead of conversations. Our bond became bureaucratic, a transaction between the manager of a trust and its diminishing beneficiary. Yet beneath all that formality, I was rebuilding something fragile and vital, my own will. Late one night, unable to sleep, I opened the teapot and unfolded the document from the escrow office. I read it again slowly, tracing my name with my fingertip. It wasn't much, but it was a foothold, a fragment of authority the world had tried to erase. I realized that I didn't need permission to act on it. The next morning, I would go back to the lawyer, not to ask for help, but to assert what was mine. I wasn't sure yet what form that would take, a withdrawal, a transfer, a reclamation, but I knew that waiting had expired. As the first light crept across the room, I felt something that might have been courage, or maybe just exhaustion from being silent too long. My daughter had built her control on the assumption that I was incapable of movement, but movement, even the smallest kind, is rebellion. And rebellion, once begun, doesn't stop politely at the door. The morning I decided to return to the lawyer's office was gray and windless, the kind of weather that makes sound travel strangely, flattening the world into a single, muffled tone. I dressed carefully, choosing my clothes with a deliberateness that surprised even me. The navy coat again, pressed the night before, and the scarf with the small embroidered initials my husband had once admired. Dressing became a ritual of reclamation, a slow, quiet act of remembering that I could still choose how to present myself to the world. As I left the apartment without calling Clara, without even leaving a note, though part of me anticipated her reaction with a grim satisfaction. The elevator smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and loneliness, and when the doors opened to the street, the city air met me like a test. I walked to the bus stop with measured steps, aware that this small act of leaving unannounced was a rebellion in itself. The lawyer's office was quieter than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply listening differently now. The receptionist recognized me and offered tea while I waited, her politeness unremarkable but oddly grounding. When I was ushered into the office, the lawyer looked surprised to see me again so soon. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I wasn't expecting you. Is there an issue with the documents?" I sat down slowly, folding my gloves on my lap. "No issue," I said. "I've come to make sure the issue remains mine." He smiled cautiously, the way professionals do when they sense a shift they don't fully understand. I explained that I wanted to transfer the remaining funds from the escrow to a private account, one with my name only. He hesitated, then asked gently, "Does your daughter know about this?" The question was careful, clinical, but beneath it lay an assumption that stung, that my choices required oversight. "She doesn't," I said, "and she doesn't need to. This is my property, my consent, my life." He nodded after a pause, then began the necessary arrangements. While he typed, I studied the office bookshelves behind him, rows of law volumes and certificates, all testaments to the formal recognition of truth. The sound of his keyboard was rhythmic, soothing, almost ceremonial. When he finally printed the forms for me to sign, I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't excitement exactly, but a sense of gravity, as if each signature were an incantation, reversing years of silence. I signed carefully, my hand steady, and watched as he sealed the papers into a folder. Once this is processed, the funds will be transferred into your account, he said. You'll receive confirmation within 3 business days. I thanked him, though words felt inadequate. Before leaving, I asked if there was any legal way to prevent my daughter from interfering again. He looked at me with an expression that blended sympathy and caution. Yes, he said, but that would require rewriting certain permissions. It might strain your relationship. I smiled faintly. It's already strained, I said. Now I'd like to make it balanced. When I stepped back onto the street, the clouds had begun to lift. I walked without direction for a while, my mind a strange mixture of exhaustion and elation. Each step felt like recovery from anesthesia, painful but real. I stopped at a bakery, ordered a small loaf of bread, and sat by the window while it cooled in my hands. Across the street, a young mother was scolding her child gently, bending to wipe his tears. The sight pierced me unexpectedly. I remembered being that young once, remembering Clara's small fingers gripping mine as we crossed roads together. There had been a time when her dependence on me had made me feel indispensable. Now, the roles had reversed so violently that I almost laughed. I wondered briefly when love had become indistinguishable from possession. By the time I returned home, dusk was settling. The apartment, with its carefully arranged furniture and neutral tones, seemed to regard me warily. It smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser Clara had given me, a scent I now associated with control, disguised as comfort. I took off my coat, placed the bakery bag on the counter, and went straight to the teapot. I removed the folded papers hidden beneath the coins, replaced them with the lawyer's new documents, and felt an almost childlike thrill at the secrecy. I brewed tea and sat down, letting the warmth settle into my bones. The silence in the room felt different, no longer sterile, but expectant. The following days passed with a deceptive calm. Clara called several times, and I answered each time with measured cheerfulness, offering only surface details about my routine. She sounded distracted, preoccupied, as if some unease had begun to ripple through her efficiency. "You sound different," she said during one call. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I smiled into the receiver. "Everything's fine, dear. I'm just taking better care of myself." She hesitated before replying, her tone sharpening. "You know you can always tell me if something's wrong." "I will," I said, "when something is." After we hung up, I realized that the balance of power had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that I could feel the air around me stretch and breathe. 3 days later, the transfer cleared. The message arrived by mail. Thin envelope, formal print, no flourish. The sum was smaller than the fortune she had appropriated, but it was mine, fully and legally. I sat at the table and read the letter twice, then 3 times, as if repetition could anchor its truth. The words didn't glow, but they pulsed with quiet vindication. I had expected to feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was something purer: steadiness. For months I had been treated like a liability, a fragile extension of someone else's responsibility. Now, with that simple confirmation, I had stepped out of the category of dependence. I poured myself another cup of tea and whispered aloud, "You see, I can handle it." The room didn't answer, but it felt less empty. That evening, I took a walk to the park. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp leaves. I sat on a bench and watched the city lights flicker across the lake in the distance, thinking of the house that no longer belonged to me. I imagined its new owners preparing dinner, unaware that the woman who had built that home from dust and devotion still existed within walking distance of its reflection. I realized then that ownership wasn't the same as possession. It was memory that held the truest claim. The house could change hands, its walls repainted, its rooms filled with strangers, but the essence of what had been built there remained in me. For the first time, that thought didn't sting. It steadied. As I walked back home, I stopped by the corner cafe again. The same waitress greeted me with a smile. "Back so soon?" she asked. "I told you this place grows on you." I sat by the window and ordered tea and pie. The simple act of choosing, of spending my own money, of sitting where I pleased, felt almost revolutionary. I paid in cash, deliberately, savoring the weight of the bills in my hand. The girl thanked me and slipped a small cookie onto my saucer. "On the house," she said. That gesture, so unassuming, filled me with an unexpected tenderness. Freedom, I realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it offered you a cookie and called you by your name. When I returned to the apartment that night, there was a voicemail waiting on the answering machine. Clara's voice was taut, controlled but threaded with irritation. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you. Why didn't you answer earlier? Also, I saw a notification from the bank about a withdrawal. Did you authorize something? Call me immediately." I stood there listening to her voice, feeling the old reflex to apologize rise and then dissolve. I deleted the message without replying. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but space, mine to fill as I wished. That night, sleep came easily. I dreamt of the lake, but not of the house. Instead, I saw the dock, rebuilt, sturdy, extending into the calm water under a gold sky. My husband stood at the end of it, not beckoning, but watching, his face unshadowed. When I woke, I felt no ache, only clarity. It was as though the act of reclaiming even a fragment of my life had revived not just autonomy, but perspective. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm. I began making plans, not grand ones, just small outlines of possible futures. I thought about moving closer to the lake, about maybe renting a small place nearby, one I could afford with the money that was rightfully mine. I pictured a life that didn't revolve around permission, a life where I could open my own door without first checking whose approval it might offend. I even allowed myself to imagine the expression on Clara's face when she realized that her carefully managed world had sprung a leak she couldn't patch. But the fantasy wasn't vindictive. It was liberating. I didn't want to punish her. I wanted to stop being her project. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls with amber light, I took the teapot from its shelf, emptied it of the remaining coins, and washed it clean. It had served its purpose. I dried it carefully and placed it back in its spot, gleaming and hollow, no longer a hiding place, but a symbol of completion. I sat by the window with my tea and whispered, "It begins now." The words sounded steady, almost foreign, as if spoken by a new version of me, a woman stepping quietly but decisively out of the long shadow of her daughter's care. The first sign that Clara knew something had changed was the tone of her voice on the phone, a brittle calm stretched too thin to conceal irritation. She called one Tuesday evening as I was returning from the cafe with a small bag of pastries. Her words were crisp, professional, her sentences tightly measured, like a woman trying to keep control of a conversation already lost. "Mom," she began, skipping the greeting she usually rehearsed when pretending warmth. "I was reviewing some financial notifications this morning, and I noticed there have been several withdrawals from the joint account, as well as activity on a new account under your name. Would you like to explain that? For a moment I said nothing, only listened to the sound of her breathing, fast, shallow, not the confident rhythm of someone in command. I placed the pastries on the counter, unwrapped the paper carefully, and said, "There's nothing to explain. I moved what belongs to me." There was a pause long enough to make the air tremble. Then she spoke, each word enunciated like a lawyer dictating a threat. That wasn't the agreement. I smiled into the silence, even though she couldn't see it. I wasn't aware there was one. The conversation that followed unfolded with the inevitable precision of a collision. She accused, I deflected. She raised her voice, I lowered mine. The louder she grew, the calmer I became, until her authority began to sound like panic. "Mom, you're being irresponsible," she said finally, her composure cracking. "You're not thinking clearly. You could be taken advantage of. This is exactly why I took over the finances, to protect you from these impulses." I said quietly, "The only person who has taken advantage of me is you." For a long time, there was nothing on the line but breathing. Then, in a tone so cold it could have frozen water, she said, "We'll talk in person." The call ended abruptly. I stood in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the soft hum of appliances and the faint scent of pastries cooling on the counter. I had imagined this moment before, the confrontation, the exposure of her deceit, but I hadn't realized how strangely calm it would feel. There was no triumph, only an almost mathematical sense of balance being restored. The next day I expected her to arrive early, but morning passed into afternoon without any sign of her. I brewed tea, read, waited. It wasn't until dusk that I heard the decisive knock, sharp enough to rattle the picture frames. When I opened the door, Clara stood there in a navy suit, her expression polished into neutrality. Behind her eyes, though, was something raw, almost pleading. "May I come in?" she asked, though she was already stepping past me. She walked to the center of the living room and turned, her arms folded. "You've made things unnecessarily complicated," she said. "I had everything organized. You were secure, provided for, comfortable. Why are you sabotaging that?" I watched her as one watches an approaching storm, beautiful, dangerous, inevitable. "Comfortable," I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting word." So is prisoner. They're often mistaken for one another. She flinched, then recovered, slipping back into the polished cadence of her professional self. "Mom, please, let's not turn this into something dramatic. I'm trying to protect you." I sat down, not to rest, but to claim the space. Protect me from what? From the world? From myself? Or from realizing that you've built your sense of worth on my dependence? She exhaled sharply, as if struck. "That's not fair," she said. "I've spent years taking care of you, sacrificing my own time, my peace of mind." "You took my home," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "You took my name off the deed. You sold the life I built and called it efficiency. And when I trusted you, you called me incapable. Tell me, Clara, when did love start sounding like control?" The question hung between us, heavy and unanswerable. She turned away, pacing near the window, the city lights flickering against her profile. For a moment she looked lost, and I saw not the woman she had become, but the child she once was, the one who used to bring me wildflowers from the garden, proud of every tiny discovery. But the softness passed quickly. When she turned back to me, her eyes were dry and sharp again. "You're not well," she said quietly. "You've been confused, emotional. I'm going to make an appointment with Dr. Levin for a cognitive assessment. It's better to be proactive. The words were so measured, so calculated, that it took me a moment to understand them. A cognitive assessment, I repeated. You're saying I'm senile? No, she said smoothly, but there are early signs: forgetfulness, impulsive decisions, paranoia. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I stared at her, almost laughing at the audacity. She was laying the groundwork, brick by brick, for my erasure, this time under the guise of concern. You're building your case, I said softly, against your own mother. She didn't deny it. I'm building a safety net, she replied, because you won't stop trying to destroy yourself. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, a steady metronome counting down to something inevitable. Finally, she said, I'll call you tomorrow with the appointment details. Please don't do anything rash in the meantime. Then she picked up her bag and left without another word. The door closed with a finality that made the air feel vacuumed of oxygen. I stood there for a moment, gripping the back of a chair until the dizziness passed. Then I walked to the window and watched her car pull away, its headlights slicing through the twilight. I realized then that the war had begun in earnest. The next morning, I called the lawyer again. I explained, with a steadiness I didn't know I possessed, that my daughter might attempt to challenge my competence or access my accounts under false pretenses. He listened carefully, then said, Mrs. Hayes, you're within your rights to protect your autonomy. I can help you file a statement of legal independence. It's a simple process, but it carries weight. I thanked him, made the appointment, and hung up. For the rest, it felt absurd, defending one's sanity with documentation, but absurdity had long since ceased to surprise me. 2 days later, Clara showed up unannounced again, this time with a different tone. She was softer, her eyes red-rimmed, her smile trembling at the edges. Mom, she said, sitting down without invitation, I don't want us to fight. You're my mother. I worry about you. I watched her carefully, waiting for the pivot I knew would come. It did. If you would just sign a simple power of attorney, limited, of course, I could handle all the complicated paperwork. You wouldn't have to stress about anything. You could relax, enjoy your life. The word relax landed like an insult. No, I said quietly. She blinked. No? No, Clara. I won't sign anything else. I won't transfer, authorize, or relinquish another thing. You've had enough of me. Her composure cracked completely then. You're making a fool of yourself, she hissed. Do you have any idea how this looks? People will think I've abandoned you. They'll think you're unstable. Let them, I said. Let them see what happens when a mother finally says no. Her lips trembled, then tightened into a thin line. She stood abruptly. Fine, do what you want, but don't come to me when you realize how much you need me. I smiled faintly. I already have realized it. I don't. She left in silence this time, but the door slammed harder. That evening, I gathered the papers into a neat folder and took them to the lawyer the next morning. We filled out the forms confirming my financial and mental competence, signed in the presence of a witness, and notarized everything. When it was done, I felt something shift internally, like a lock sliding into place. I walked out of the building lighter, though I knew the confrontation ahead would be fierce. I spent that week avoiding Clara's calls, responding only with brief texts that said I was fine. On Friday, a letter arrived from a legal office I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice. My daughter had filed a petition requesting medical evaluation to assess my decision-making capacity. I read it twice, feeling first disbelief, then an eerie calm. So this was her final card. She wanted to declare me unfit, the ultimate erasure. I placed the letter on the table next to my teacup and let the anger pass through me without taking root. Then I picked up the phone and called my lawyer again. "It started," I said. "Then we'll answer," he replied. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I prepared meticulously, assembling every document, every receipt, every note from my doctor confirming my excellent health. When the appointed day came, I arrived early, dressed immaculately, hair done, posture straight. Clara was already there, standing with the doctor, her expression a mixture of confidence and pity. She greeted me as though I were a guest at my own trial. "Mom," she said gently, "this is just a formality, nothing to worry about." I smiled. "I'm not worried." The interview was long but strangely liberating. The doctor asked about my finances, my daily routines, my understanding of the situation. I answered clearly, even humorously, occasionally turning the questions back on him with quiet wit. Clara's expression shifted gradually from assurance to discomfort. When it was over, the doctor shook my hand. "Mrs. Hayes, you seem remarkably sharp," he said. "I'll have no trouble confirming your capacity." Clara said nothing on the way out. She simply walked ahead, her steps too quick, her silence louder than accusation. A week later, the report arrived. No cognitive impairment. Full capacity confirmed. I placed it beside the earlier legal documents in my drawer. The battle was over before it even began. When Clara finally called, her voice was brittle, her sentences clipped. "Congratulations," she said. "You've proved your point." "It wasn't a point," I said. "It was my life." She hung up. That night, I sat by the window again, the city lights softer than usual, the hum of traffic distant but reassuring. I realized that Clara's fury no longer frightened me. I had faced it, named it, and walked through it unburned. What lingered instead was a quiet sadness, not for myself but for her, for the woman so consumed by the need to control that she'd mistaken it for love. I thought of the house by the lake, of the girl she once was, running barefoot in the grass, laughing. I wished I could have told that child that power was not protection, that love was not possession, but perhaps some lessons must be learned through ruin. As I turned off the light and prepared for bed, I glanced at the empty teapot on the shelf, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It no longer needed to hide anything. Everything worth keeping was already within me. The knowledge of what I'd endured, what I'd reclaimed, and what I would never again surrender. And though I didn't yet know what my next step would be, I knew this. Whatever it was, it would be entirely my own. It was almost spring by the time I knew exactly what I wanted to do. The city had begun to thaw, and with it something inside me loosened, something that had been frozen in silence for far too long. I would walk each morning along the same street, past the flower market where tulips were already stacked in damp buckets, past the bakery that now greeted me by name, and I would think about how simple freedom actually looked once you stripped it of drama. It wasn't grand gestures or speeches. It was the ability to choose how to spend a day without asking permission. I had money again, modest but clean, untainted by manipulation. The lake called to me in quiet ways, like an old friend waiting patiently, and I began to visit it more often, sometimes sitting on the bench for hours, watching the slow shimmer of light on water. The house itself was gone from me, but the landscape was still mine in memory, and I realized I didn't want to reclaim walls and furniture. What I wanted was to rebuild a sense of belonging, to stand in the place where I had once been whole and not feel diminished by loss. One afternoon, I found a "For Rent" sign nailed to the fence of an old boathouse, not far from where our dock had once been. The paint was peeling, the windows fogged with years of neglect, but there was something in its weary shape that spoke to me. The landlord, a man about my daughter's age, seemed surprised when I asked about leasing it. "It's small," he warned, "barely more than a storage shed. You sure you don't want something newer?" I smiled. "No, I want something that survived." He laughed, but there was respect in his eyes. Within a week, the place was mine, just a single room overlooking the water, with a narrow porch and a door that stuck in the morning chill. The first day I unlocked it, I stood inside, breathing the scent of old wood and lake air, and I knew that this, at last, was where the story would turn. I spent the next month fixing it up myself. I scrubbed floors, painted walls, mended the door frame with nails I found in a forgotten tin. The work hurt my joints but healed my mind. There was something almost sacred about touching the world again with purpose, about seeing tangible results of my own labor. Neighbors wandered by, curious about the old woman renovating a shack by herself, and I told them I was opening a small tea room, just a few tables for anyone who wanted a quiet view with their tea. They laughed at first, thinking it a hobby, but soon they began bringing small gifts: an old kettle, a set of mismatched cups, a wooden sign one of the local teenagers carved that read "Lakeside Rest." Every item felt like a blessing. By May, the place was ready. On opening day, I baked scones, using the same recipe my husband had loved, brewed pots of Earl Grey and chamomile, and placed vases of fresh tulips on each table. I didn't expect many customers, but by noon the room was full: fishermen, tourists, and women from nearby cottages, some young, some old, all drawn by the scent of baking and the promise of calm. They sat and talked, laughed, and sometimes simply watched the water in silence. I served them, listened to their stories, and felt something open inside me, a wide, steady warmth I hadn't felt in years. There was no hierarchy here, no oversight, no one telling me what I could or couldn't handle. Every cup I poured was an act of ownership, every smile an exchange of dignity. Word spread quickly, as it tends to in small towns. Within a few weeks, the local newspaper printed a small piece about me titled "Retired Innkeeper Revives Beloved Lakeside Tradition." I didn't know the journalist who wrote it, but she captured something tender. Mrs. Hayes says she isn't running a business. She's tending to memory. The article included a photo of me behind the counter, hair tied back, smiling faintly. When I saw it in print, I felt a jolt of recognition. There I was, visible again, not as a dependent or a burden, but as a woman with a name and a purpose. I cut out the clipping and framed it, not out of vanity, but as proof that I had returned to myself. Of course, news travels to those you least wish to hear it. One afternoon, as the sun was sinking low, I saw a familiar car pull into the small gravel lot. Clara stepped out, immaculate as ever, her heels sinking slightly in the damp earth. She stood there for a moment, surveying the tea room with an expression I couldn't quite read, half disbelief, half outrage. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to meet her. "You found me," I said quietly. She forced a smile. "You're in the paper, Mom." I had clients sending me the article, asking if it was the same Hayes from the old inn. Imagine my surprise. Her voice had the brittle edge of embarrassment masquerading as amusement. "I suppose congratulations are in order," she added, though the word congratulations sounded more like accusation. She followed me inside, looking around with the critical eye of someone inspecting damage control. "You shouldn't be doing this," she said. "You're exhausting yourself. What if you fall? What if someone sues you? I poured her tea without asking if she wanted it. Then I'll get up, I said. And if someone sues me, I'll hire a lawyer. I've gotten quite good at that. She ignored the jab, stirring her cup mechanically. This isn't sustainable, she said. You're not a young woman anymore. You can't handle this kind of work. The words struck the air between us like the echo of a curse, the same sentence she had spoken months ago, the one that had ignited everything. I met her gaze steadily. You're wrong, I said. I can handle this. I always could. It's you who couldn't handle me. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then she set her cup down with deliberate care, her voice suddenly small. Why are you doing this to me? I almost laughed at the irony. Doing what, Clara? Living? Making me look like a villain, she said. People think I've mistreated you. I leaned against the counter, watching her. You're not a villain, I said softly. You're just someone who doesn't understand that love without respect is possession, and possession, no matter how pretty it looks, always ends in loss. Her eyes filled, but she blinked them dry. You've changed, she said. Yes, I answered. That was the point. She stood, gathering her bag, clearly searching for something final to say. What happens when you get tired, Mom? When this all falls apart? You'll come running back, and I'll still be the one to pick up the pieces. I shook my head. No, Clara, I've already picked them up. You're just afraid that without my dependence, you'll have to face your own emptiness. She stared at me then, as if seeing me for the first time, not as a frail mother to be managed, but as an adversary, or perhaps as an equal. That recognition, painful as it was, felt like the truest victory I could have hoped for. When she finally left, the sky was turning a deep blue, the color of my husband's favorite tie. I watched her car disappear down the winding road, and for a moment I felt the sharp ache of finality, the knowledge that some distances, once created, can never fully close. But there was no regret, only stillness. I turned the sign on the door to closed and walked back to the counter. The tea had gone cold, but I drank it anyway, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue like a truth long deferred. A week later, a lawyer's envelope arrived addressed to me. Inside was a short letter from Clara, formal and detached. She informed me that she was resigning from all financial and legal responsibilities related to my affairs. The tone was clipped, the language bureaucratic, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. She was letting go, though not out of grace, out of defeat. I folded the letter, placed it in the same frame as the newspaper clipping, and set them both on the shelf above the counter. Together, they told a story, how one woman's freedom could be both scandal and salvation, depending on who was looking. That evening, as the sun sank low, painting the lake in ribbons of fire, I took a chair outside and sat in the fading warmth. Customers had long gone home, and the air was still, save for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I thought of the long road that had brought me here, the signatures, the betrayals, the accusations of madness, and realized that none of it mattered now. What mattered was that I had acted, that I had refused to vanish quietly into the margins of someone else's life. I took out my notebook, the one I kept behind the counter for orders, and wrote a single line across the first page. Safety is not what they give you. It's what you reclaim. Then I closed it and set it aside, listening to the distant hum of a car fading into the night. The air smelled of rain and old wood and a faint sweetness from the tulips by the window. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my life resting entirely in my own hands, and it did not frighten me. It steadied me. When the moon rose over the water, I whispered into the quiet, not to anyone living, but to the memory of my husband, to the echo of who I once was. "It's handled," I said, "by me." The lake didn't answer, but its calm surface mirrored my reflection, aged, lined, yet wholly present. And that was enough. The summer that followed unfolded with a slowness that felt almost merciful, a rhythm of small consistencies and quiet mornings that no longer needed justification. The tea room found its own steady life, not grand or crowded, but continuous, like a heartbeat. Regulars began to appear at predictable hours. The fisherman who always wanted black coffee and silence, the young couple who argued affectionately about crossword clues, the widow named Irene who brought her knitting and never spoke of her late husband, but hummed softly while the kettle boiled. They became part of the fabric of my days, and I learned their patterns the way one learns the weather, without expectation, just recognition. There were no confrontations anymore, no anxious phone calls, no footsteps of intrusion. Clara's silence, once so heavy, had become a form of peace. It was not reconciliation, but it was absence without hostility, and that was enough for me. The first time I realized that weeks had passed without thinking of her, I felt both startled and relieved. Grief, I had discovered, doesn't always end. It simply changes its shape until you no longer recognize it as grief. Mine had become a faint outline in the distance, like a hill you once climbed, but can now only see from far away. Sometimes, when the wind came from the north, I imagined it carried her perfume, sharp, expensive, faintly citrus, and for a fleeting second I would feel that old pull of resentment, that ache to prove something still. But then the moment would pass, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the space between us. I no longer needed her understanding to validate my survival. I had made peace with the fact that some truths are only visible when love has loosened its grip. I began writing letters late at night, not to send, but to organize the silence inside me. They were addressed to no one in particular, sometimes to my younger self, sometimes to my husband, sometimes to the women I imagined might one day find themselves standing at the same threshold of invisibility where I once stood. The words came easily, like water from a long clogged tap. "Do not let their version of care become your cage," I wrote one night. "Do not mistake protection for love. The world will call you fragile because you are gentle, but gentleness is a choice, and that makes it power." These letters piled up in a box beneath the counter, unseen and unsent, but each one felt like a small rebellion against the silence that used to define me. By early autumn, the tea room had become something of a quiet landmark. Local children would stop by after school for cookies, and I taught a few of them how to bake properly, insisting that they measure sugar, not by weight, but by memory. Because sweetness, like kindness, should never be an exact science. The fishermen began leaving small gifts, fresh trout, jars of honey, wild flowers in chipped mugs. The world had begun to return to me, piece by piece, without permission slips or signatures. Once, a tourist stopped by and asked if I was the same Mrs. Hayes who used to run the bed and breakfast by the lake decades ago. When I said yes, she smiled and told me her parents had honeymooned there. They said it felt like home, she said. They always wanted to come back. I looked out toward the water and thought, so did I. There were still moments of loneliness, of course. Even freedom, once won, carries its own kind of solitude. In the quiet hours after closing, when the chairs were stacked and the air smelled faintly of tea leaves and wood polish, I would sit on the porch and watch the water darken. I would think of Clara then, wondering if she ever sat alone in her glass-walled apartment, staring at her reflection and feeling the absence of a mother she had turned into a concept. I no longer wished to fix it or to forgive entirely. Forgiveness, I had come to believe, was less about absolving and more about understanding. I understood her now, her fear of losing control, her confusion of love with management, her hunger to make life measurable. I had spent years living within the limits of her concern. Now she lived within the limits of her own success. We were both, in our own ways, prisoners of our creations. The difference was that I had found the key. One evening in late September, a letter arrived in handwriting I hadn't seen in months. Clara's. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only a few lines. I drove past the tea room today. It's beautiful. You look happy. I hope you are. There was no apology, no attempt at explanation, only that small, unguarded sentence. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it beside the others in my box. It felt like closure, though not the dramatic kind we imagine in stories, just a soft closing of a door that had been left ajar too long. I didn't write back. Some conversations, I had learned, don't need replies to be complete. The days grew shorter after that, the evenings cooler, and I began lighting candles inside the tea room as the sun went down. Their glow made the wooden walls look almost golden, and customers lingered longer in that warmth. Sometimes I would tell them small stories about the lake, about the inn that used to stand there, about a woman who once believed her usefulness had expired. They listened kindly, some recognizing the edges of their own lives in my words. I never mentioned names, never spoke of Clara, or the papers, or the accusations. Those belonged to the private archive of my endurance. Instead, I ended my stories with quiet advice. Keep something that is only yours, even if it's small. Especially if it's small. As winter approached, I made a habit of closing early and walking by the shore before heading home. The lake had taken on its winter calm, silver and still, the surface so smooth it mirrored the faint stars above. I would pause there, my breath clouding the air, and think of how far I had come, not in distance, but in return. I had once been erased, turned into a figure of pity, managed into silence. Now I existed wholly on my own terms, defined by no one's convenience. That realization didn't make me proud so much as profoundly peaceful. The tea room stayed open through the winter, even on the quietest days when snow pressed against the windows and only a single customer came through the door. On those days, I would brew tea just for myself and sit by the window, notebook open, continuing the letters I would never send. The last one I wrote was addressed simply to her, whoever she might be, a woman sitting somewhere right now, doubting her own strength. You will be told you cannot handle it, I wrote. That is the moment you must begin. You will not win quickly or easily, but you will outlast what tries to shrink you. And when you finally stand alone, the world will not notice at first, but you will, and that will be enough. I placed that letter on top of the others and closed the box for the last time. The tea room was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the clock and the faint whisper of wind against the glass. Outside, the lake stretched endlessly, serene and self-contained, reflecting nothing but its own calm certainty. I sat there until the candles burned low, feeling the gentle rhythm of my heartbeat and the deeper, quieter pulse of contentment that had taken its place beneath it. When I finally stood to leave, I turned off the lights and looked around one last time. The tables gleamed, the cups were stacked neatly. The sign by the door still read, Lakeside Rest. I smiled at the name, at its simplicity, at the truth it carried. Rest, I had learned, was not what you are given when others decide you've done enough. Rest is what you take back when you finally understand you deserve it. And as I stepped outside into the cold night, locking the door behind me, I felt the certainty of that truth settle gently into my bones, steady and irreversible, like the quiet end of a long, hard song that had finally resolved into peace